Okay, so ready for a deep dive into some seriously complex territory? We're going to be unpacking this article. It's called Degenerates on the Right, and it jumps right into this debate that feels so relevant these days. How do we reconcile personal beliefs with political affiliations, especially when things aren't so black and white?
Yeah, you're right. It doesn't shy away from those tough questions at all. One of the first things that really struck me was how the author tackles this idea of hypocrisy.
Okay.
They argue it's not about being perfect, because
Mm.
in their view, nobody truly is, especially, within the right-wing worldview where you have these absolute truths. So it's less about like never messing up and more about constantly striving for those ideals even when we fall short. Exactly. It's that acknowledgement of our own imperfection, that constant striving for something better that seems to be key to their perspective, at least within the right-wing framework. But then they take this idea in a really interesting direction.
Okay.
They connect it to physical appearance.
Okay, now this is where it gets interesting. They actually suggest that people on the right are often seen as more attractive.
Right. There's actually a study that suggests that, and they link it to evolutionary biology,
Whoa.
which is a pretty bold move.
Yeah.
But the argument is that right-wing views, which are often tied to things like traditional family social structures, could be seen as more evolutionarily advantageous.
So good genes, good looks, conservative values, all connected. Help me unpack this because I'm not sure I fully.
Yeah, so it's definitely controversial.
Yeah.
But the idea is that if certain traits are associated with evolutionary success, right, things like having a strong family unit to raise children, those traits might become more prevalent over time, and they might even become associated with what we consider to be physically attractive.
So it's like this feedback loop where these values get linked to those good genes, which then get linked to attractiveness.
It's a fascinating theory.
Yeah.
And whether or not you buy it, it definitely makes you think about how we perceive those with different political beliefs,
Yeah.
and even how we judge their appearances.
Yeah.
But the article doesn't just stop at appearances. It dives into the heart of the matter, behavior.
Because it's one thing to look the part, but it's another to walk the walk right.
Exactly. The author argues that if you're going to espouse certain values, your lifestyle should reflect them. They use the example of Amber Rose's appearance at the Republican National Convention,
Okay.
arguing that her past clashes with this image of high moral standards that the party aims to project.
It's almost like they're saying you can't separate the message from the messenger, but then the article tackles this whole other layer of complexity. What about when brilliant minds on the right don't fit that traditional mold?
You're talking about the part where they mention people like Douglas Murray.
Exactly. Openly gay, incredibly intelligent, and a prominent voice on the right. So it becomes this question of, can you separate someone's personal life from their intellectual contributions, especially within a movement that so often espouses traditional values?
It's that classic tension between purity and pragmatism.
Right.
On one hand, you have this ideal of what a right-wing figure should be. But on the other hand, you have these individuals making significant contributions to the movement despite not fitting neatly into that box.
And the author wrestles with this, right? They don't pretend to have all the answers. They even bring up this idea, and I'm not sure what to make of this, that maybe people with what the article calls deviant sexualities are actually more intelligent on average.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the more provocative claims in the article.
Yeah.
And they seem to suggest that it's because individuals who don't conform to societal norms might develop greater cognitive skills by constantly having to justify their choices
Interesting.
and navigate a world that doesn't always understand them.
Okay, so it's like facing those challenges actually forces you to think more critically and develop stronger arguments.
That's the gist of it. Of course, it's a generalization, and I'm not sure it's entirely fair or accurate to draw such a direct link between sexuality and intelligence.
Yeah.
But it does raise interesting questions about how we think about conformity intelligence and the experiences that shape our perspectives.
Yeah. It's a lot to unpack, and it gets even more complex when the article kind of takes this turn towards a biblical perspective.
Right. They bring in that quote from Ephesians talking about how certain lifestyles can cloud someone's ability to see the truth.
Right.
It's a very specific worldview they're presenting.
Yeah, and they use a really challenging example to illustrate this point, pedophilia.
Yeah.
The author acknowledges the sensitivity of the topic, of course,
Right.
and the fact that redemption is always possible for anyone,
Right.
but it's still heavy stuff.
It is. They're essentially arguing that engaging in certain behaviors can hinder one's ability to perceive truth. It's not about condemning individuals, but rather about acknowledging the potential impact of our actions on our own moral compass, so to speak.
It's like they're saying our behaviors have consequences,
Yeah.
not just in the eyes of others, but also in terms of how we see the world and ourselves. And this leads to what I think is a central question. Should people who embody a specific ideology, particularly a traditional one, be held to a higher standard?
That's where they bring up the example of former adult film stars becoming religious figures.
Right.
It's like redemption might be possible, but does that mean those individuals should be leading the charge?
Right. Should their past disqualify them from holding positions of authority or influence within that movement? It's a tough question with no easy answers.
Yes.
And the article doesn't pretend to have those answers. In fact, they take us even deeper into this debate by drawing a historical parallel with Nazi Germany and the Night of the Long Knives,
Yeah.
where Ernst Röhm, a gay man who was also a high-ranking Nazi official, was executed. Talk about a stark reminder that these debates about aligning values with actions can have very real and very serious consequences. It's almost like they're saying these questions about personal choices and traditional values. They're not just theoretical debates, you know?
Yeah.
They have real-world implications, even life or death ones in some cases. But then the article shifts gears a bit and starts talking about how these dynamics play out on a societal level.
Right. Yeah, they move from focusing on individuals to looking at the broader cultural context.
Yeah.
And one of the first things they address is this idea that behaviors like homosexuality and cross-dressing, they've always existed,
Yeah.
even in societies that we might consider very traditional.
So they're acknowledging that these behaviors aren't new, but they're not necessarily saying that means those societies were accepting of them.
Exactly. They're drawing a distinction between the mere existence of something and the outright celebration or normalization of it.
Okay.
The argument seems to be that while these lifestyles might have always been present in some form, they weren't always embraced or considered acceptable by the majority.
It's like the difference between something being tolerated and something being
Right.
celebrated.
Yeah.
Two very different things.
Precisely. And they actually use ancient Greece as an example because it often held up as this society that was completely accepting of homosexuality. But they challenged that notion,
Interesting.
suggesting it was far more complex and nuanced than that.
It's a reminder that history is rarely black and white. We can't just impose our modern values and understandings onto the past.
Absolutely. And this leads to what I think is a really crucial point in the article. This idea that the modern-day normalization and celebration of certain lifestyles, this represents a significant shift. It's not just about individual choices anymore. It's about how those choices are framed and embraced by society as a whole.
And that framing matters, right? Because if society starts normalizing behaviors that directly clash with the core values of a specific ideology or movement, it's going to create tension and conflict.
Exactly. It circles back to that central question we've been discussing. How do right-wing movements, often built on these traditional values and ideals, how do they navigate this increasingly complex and diverse world?
Yeah, it's a question with massive implications. Because on one hand, you have this push for inclusivity, welcoming a diversity of voices and experiences. But on the other, you have this need to uphold the principles and beliefs that define the movement.
It's a delicate balancing act, and I think the author does a good job of illustrating the challenges without pretending to have all the answers. They leave us with more questions than answers, which is often the mark of a truly thought-provoking piece.
It's true. Like they've given us all the pieces of a puzzle, but they're not telling us how they fit together. We have to figure that out for ourselves.
Yeah, it's like the author saying, here's this complex, multifaceted issue, now you grapple with it.
Yeah.
It's refreshing in a way to see a piece that doesn't shy away from the gray areas.
Absolutely. And it's in those gray areas where the most interesting conversations happen. Because it's easy to make snap judgments, about individuals or groups. But this article really forces us to dig deeper, to consider the nuances and complexities.
It's like that saying, don't judge a book by its cover.
Right.
We can't just assume we understand someone's beliefs or values based on surface-level observations
Yeah.
or assumptions about their lifestyle.
And it goes beyond just individuals, too. This article really got me thinking about how these tensions play out within entire organizations and movements.
Interesting. How do you balance inclusivity with maintaining a clear set of principles?
Especially in a world that's becoming increasingly diverse, and where the lines between personal choices and political affiliations can get really blurry.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there's no one-size-fits-all answer. It requires ongoing dialogue, critical thinking, and a willingness to engage with those difficult questions.
It's like a constant balancing act, right? How do you stay true to your core values while also evolving with the times and embracing a broader range of perspectives?
And how do you create a space where people feel welcome to contribute their talents and ideas, even if their personal choices might not align perfectly with every aspect of the movement's ideology.
Yeah.
These are questions that every group, regardless of political affiliation, has to grapple with.
It's like that idea we talked about earlier, purity versus pragmatism. It's a tension that exists in so many areas of life, but it feels especially relevant in the world of politics and social movements.
Yeah, and what makes this conversation even more fascinating is that there's no end point, no final answer. It's an ongoing process of navigating these complexities, of having those tough conversations, and hopefully becoming more understanding and empathetic along the way.
Which is what a good deep dive should do, right? Challenge our assumptions, make us think critically, and leave us with more questions than answers.
Definitely.
And this one definitely delivered. So, to listeners out there, we'll leave you with this. The article focused on individuals, but what about those bigger entities? How should right-wing organizations navigate this tension between values and inclusivity, especially as they grow and evolve in today's world?
Mhm.
Food for thought. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been quite a journey.